Good morning and welcome, or good afternoon and welcome to this third round of the ISDP series Korea Strategic Talks. My name is Mats Engman and I'm head of the ISDP Korea Center here in Stockholm. These strategic talks aims to promote dialogue and exchange of views related to the developments on the Korean peninsula and in the region. The first two rounds of talks took place last year, where we discussed the regional developments and the situation in DPRK. Today, we continue with the third round of talks focusing on the domestic political situation in South Korea following the recent presidential election. We strive to have a series of at least two conversations within a rather short time span, covering the same issues but from different perspectives. This, we believe, will enable us to identify possible difference in understanding, assessments, and policies. Before today's strategic talk, we conducted another talk on the 12th of June, covering the very same topics as today, but with two Korean experts. But back to today's talk. I'm very, very pleased to have two true experts with me today to guide us through the possible implications of the June 3 presidential election in South Korea. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Jenny Town. She is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and the director of the Stimson's Korea program and the well-known 38 North. Her areas of expertise include North Korea, US DPRK relations, US ROC alliance relations and extended deterrence, and Northeast Regional Security. Ms. Town is also an Associate Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, a member of the National Committee on North Korea, and an Associate Member of the Council of Korean Americans. She holds a Bachelor in East Asian Studies and International Relations from Westmar University and a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University. She is a frequent commentator for a range of different US and international media, including Reuters, BBC, CNN, Financial Times, Deutsche Welle, Japan Times, and more. Next, Mr. Bruce Klingner. He specializes in Korean and Japanese affairs as the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center. Mr. Klingner joined the Heritage in 2007, and before joining, he has 20 years of service at the Central Intelligence Agency, including 5 years as the Deputy Division Chief for Korea, and has also worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. He holds a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the Defense Intelligence College and is a distinguished graduate from the National War College, where he received a master's degree in national security strategy. Like Jenny, Bruce is a frequent commentator in US and foreign media. His articles and commentary have appeared in major American and foreign publications, and he is a regular guest on broadcast and cable news outlets. To summarize, today we have the honor to listen and learn from two true experts on Korea issues. I have asked both our participants to kick off this session with a short introduction, after we will engage in our conversation. Time permitting, we may be able to take one or two questions from you, our viewers. With that, I'll hand over the microphone to you, Jenny, please.
Thanks, Mats, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to see you. It's great to see Bruce, as always. It's such an interesting time to have this discussion, given all that's going on right now, not only in Korea, but in the US and in US relations with the Middle East, with the G7 and everything else. So if we look back to the Korean election, though, I think, I think it was really a good example of how fluid and dynamic Korean politics really is. Lee Jae-myung should have been a runaway election given both the grave impact of Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law debacle back in December and consequent flaming of domestic tensions. But it wasn't exactly a runaway result. There was only an 8 percentage point difference between Lee Jae-myung and the competitor, the PPP, People Power Party, conservative PPP, Kim Moon-soo. Um, that's not much. And it really doesn't give a strong mandate for Lee Jae-myung. And I think it shows really how divisive of a character Lee Jae-myung really is. This was only 8 percentage points different, even after all the infighting that went on in the PPP throughout the very short election process. With different attempts to change the candidate even after Kim Moon-soo was elected. So I think there's a lot of challenges in front of Lee Jae-myung, and it's great that there's finally a president that can set goals, can set policies, and the country can start to get back to some sense of normalcy. But there's enormous tasks ahead of Lee Jae-myung, and without that strong mandate, he's going to be fought at every step of the way, even with the majority in the National Assembly. Of the major tasks ahead is to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula and really deal with the economic situation, since the country's been in crisis for the past 6 months. And on both fronts, it takes two to tango. And there's really going to be challenges coming not from Lee Jae-myung himself, but from Trump and Kim on how easy or how difficult that road is going to be to economic recovery and to tension reduction on the Korean Peninsula. I think so far, Kim Jong-un has been receptive to some of the early moves that Lee Jae-myung has taken, such as stopping the loudspeakers. North Korea has reciprocated that action. And North Korea has always said that, their mantra is power for power and goodwill for goodwill. And so I think, this is a good test of that. But at the same time, some of the other points on Lee Jae-myung's agenda domestically in dealing with North Korea are going to be controversial, such as targeting, again, leaflet campaigns and other things going over the border. Obviously on the US front, and I'm sure Bruce will talk more about this, there's a lot of challenges in dealing with Trump, and especially in this current geopolitical environment. Trade negotiations are not going to be easy, and especially with the NATO summit coming up soon, the word of the day is burden sharing. So this is definitely going to be an issue, and will be a big test of the Lee Jae-myung administration very early on.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for setting the scene for the conversation, and like to pass the microphone to you, Bruce.
Right.
Please.
Well, here in Washington, the main focus or interest would be on what Lee Jae-myung's foreign and security policies will be. But as Jenny pointed out, there's a lot of domestic issues that he has to deal with, and you sort of wonder why anyone would want to be president in South Korea, especially now. Also, given the track record of what happens to South Korean presidents after they leave office, I think, since the founding of the republic, I think only 2 presidents have not been indicted or jailed or assassinated or couped against. So it's not a very good track record. But on the domestic issue, we have a slow economy. You have this bitterly divided electorate. And as Jenny pointed out, it wasn't a runaway for Lee Jae-myung, because I think a lot of people, even if they didn't support Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration, just really despise or dislike Lee Jae-myung so much that they just couldn't vote for him. But I think it was enough of a difference in the voting that Lee Jae-myung may see it as a mandate, and then with a strong majority. So on the domestic side, I think the question is, will he be the unifier that he says he will be, or is he going to go after the real or perceived political enemies? We saw when Yoon Suk-yeol was in office that the DP really went after Yoon, not just trying to block his agenda, but 29 or more impeachments against Yoon and his wife, and senior officials and even judges. And so when you see the DP saying, well, we didn't like the ruling of that judge, so we're going to try to impeach that judge, you have to wonder, is it going to be a vindictive administration, not just wanting to fulfill their agenda, but really going after anyone who they perceive as disagreeing with them? On the foreign and security policies, the big question will be that Lee Jae-myung, as many politicians do, campaigned in the center, but will he go back to ruling from the edges? So he dropped or moderated a lot of his former comments about what I would describe as conciliatory policies towards North Korea and China, nationalist, antagonistic policies towards Japan, and then a more aloof, independent role for South Korea in its relationship and alliance with the United States. At one point calling U.S. forces occupying forces. So his senior officials that we've met with have really emphasized that this is an evolved DP. It's not the bomb throwing communists of the past, just to coin a phrase. But it's a lot of skepticism. I think he will kind of go back to his roots. We've already seen not only the cancellation of the loudspeakers, propaganda loudspeakers against North Korea, but calling for and taking action to impede non-government organizations from sending leaflets into North Korea. So which would seem to perhaps violate a constitutional court ruling of a few years ago. But so we'll have to see. And I think just in closing, but he will face a lot of constraints in how far forward or fast he can move in relations with China and North Korea. North Korea isn't interested in talking with South Korea or the U.S., having repeatedly rejected U.S. attempts to pass a love letter from Trump. And there's a very strong anti-China feeling amongst the South Korean populace. So as much as Yi may want to reduce tensions with China and North Korea, there will be, I think, constraints on his actions. So at this point, certainly far more questions than answers.
Okay, thank you. I find it interesting that both of you raises this issue of well, we get the picture in a lot of the media in the West that he won a rather decisive victory. He has a large majority in the National Assembly, indicating and pointing the way that he may be able to do things that most other politicians would be envy at, having the party controlling both the assembly and controlling the executive. But I would like to pick up on something both of you mentioned, and this about being a unifier or not when it comes to the domestic situation. Because in one of his earlier statements, he mentioned being a president for all. I think it was in his inaugural speech. And I suppose that is trying to address the polarization that we have seen in South Korea recently. So what more in detail do you think we can expect? And is he likely to attempt to bridge some of this societal and political divide by introducing more of collaboration and compromise in South Korean politics? Or will he try to stick to his kind of what he may think is a rather strong mandate from the voters? So what else can he do in order to try to bridge this societal and political divide in South Korea? Any ideas, Jenny?
Yeah, I think there's, again, it wasn't a runaway election by any means. Kim Won-soo had 41%, Lee Jae-myung had 49%, Lee Jun-suk had, close to 10%. If Kim Won-soo and Lee Jun-suk had unified as they had talked about a week before the election, it would have been a very, very close election, much as like what we saw in the last cycle when Yoon Suk-yeol barely squeaked by and won that election. So, this notion that Lee Jae-myung is going to be this centrist and unifier, in the early days of his administration already, we've seen some pretty decisive moves. including, opening probes on the Yoon Suk-yeol former administration officials to their role in the martial law event. And that's not necessarily the first thing you would do if you were really trying to be a unifier. And again, it shows that he does have the majority in the National Assembly. He is able to do these things because he has the power base for it. But it's not necessarily the right message. At the same time, he is trying to look like more of a man of the people. And there was definitely some conservatives who, backed Lee Jae-myung in the election, largely because there wasn't a real conservative voice and conservative consensus for them to go with. And an interesting thing, it's early days, of course. Lee Jae-myung has not chosen, the majority of his cabinet yet. And he has created this now nomination process where people can write in nominations of who they think should be in different cabinet positions. I'm not sure, again, that that's really the best way to create consensus either. I think Wee Sung-lak was a great choice for the National Security Council. He is known for being very worldly, very internationalist, very centrist. He is sort of the new party versus, some of the old party, as Bruce was referring to earlier. But already the prime minister nomination is under controversy for views on, LGBTQ statements that has been said in the past and stances he's taken in the past already. Some of the nominations that he has made are controversial. And now this nomination process brings a lot of uncertainty of at what point does he really, try to carry this narrative, or does his, natural instincts in his former political career really shine through? And, given the pushback that he's going to get at every single stage, like I said, this is a very thorny environment, both domestically and internationally, where there's not going to be a lot of easy choices. And how he navigates that, I think, is going to be really important, because if he does rely back on this notion of, weaponizing courts and against political opposition and carries that through, then we really haven't advanced very far from what we saw at the end of the Yoon administration.
Thank you, Jenny. What's your take on this, the President for All narrative, Bruce? Is this, do you think there is a receptiveness on, let's say, the conservative side to try to support him if he wants to make a few actions to bridge the gap and the societal divide?
Well, I think it's a phrase that probably any president would say after his election. And, I think a lot of times with any leader election, there's sort of a debate of, do they have a mandate? And is there some percentage of victory over the opposition that sort of equates to a mandate? I think any leader would say, I was elected. It doesn't matter what the size of the victory is. I have a mandate, or I have a job to do. I have a responsibility to everyone who voted for me to carry out the plans that I have in mind, for which they gave me the majority of the votes. So, with Yoon Suk-yeol, who won by less than a percentage point, we didn't see him saying, this was a real squeaker of an election. I have to do everything through compromise with the opposition. No, he sort of was a bull in a china shop, given his personality, and he was just trying to push through his agenda. So I think any leader will say, I've got a job to do, and I will try to work with others. And if they won't work with me, well, if he, as he does, has a very strong majority in the legislature, and he has the power of the president, I think he'll say, well, you can work with me, or you can watch as I move forward. So, and as Jenny pointed out, having, announced new investigations against Yoon Suk-yeol and his wife, that really seems to be piling on. It's almost like, look, former president is already facing criminal charges, which could lead to prison. He's been disgraced, his wife has been disgraced. Sort of, can't you just sort of take the victory and go home and work on your agenda? So I wonder, on the one hand, you could say, well, we have to go after those that uh, committed unconstitutional acts, either through martial law or other actions. But there can also be, if depending on how he does it, if it's just really a scorched earth policy of going after not only the people that did actions in the past administration, but anyone who impedes your own agenda. So I worry that, sort of given the actions of the DP when they were in the opposition, that it could be a bit of a steamroller, but we don't really know yet.
Okay, it's not only the immediate future that is of interest. I think the election result also gives us some food for thought, looking a little bit more ahead, and specifically two things that come to mind. First is the what I understand was a rather sharp both generational divide and a gender divide in voting patterns. One, and the other one is what you both referred to, the split within the conservative camp, with the young leader of the, I think it's called the Reform Party, almost took 8, 9, 10% of the votes. So are we emerging a bit of a move away from a two-party system in South Korea with a split within the conservative camp? And what about this generational divide that, looking 4 or 5 years ahead, may reshape the voting base and the voting patterns in South Korea? Do you have any thoughts on those two? Maybe you first, Bruce?
Well, I think in sort of like any party that has lost, the PPP now has its time in the wilderness. Similar to the Democratic Party here in the U.S. is,
Yeah.
Having lost an election, the question is sort of, was our message wrong, or did we pick the wrong messenger? Were we too strong in our message, or did we not? Were we too weak in our message? We should have doubled down on issues. So there will be a lot of, self-reflection and sort of circular firing squad, I'm sure, within the Conservative Party as to not only jockeying for who would be the next leader, likely presidential candidate, but a question of which way do we go? Will the PPP just be as obstructionist, though with a weaker position than the DP was under Yoon Suk-yeol? Will they try to offer alternative policies? Will they sort of be vicious themselves in their criticism and obstructionism to Lee Jae-myung and others? So I think, again, a lot more questions than answers. And South Korean political parties often seem to merge around one person or become the extension of one leader. Not so much this election, but I'm sure we're going to see a name change of the Conservative Party. It seems each party changes their name if they lose an election or if they reform around a new leading
Yeah.
candidate. I can't keep track of the history of all the names of the left and the right parties. So I think right now Lee Jae-myung clearly has the upper hand. He's got the numbers. And I think the conservatives are in disarray. We saw that in the election. It was, and in the 6 months after martial laws, do we embrace the conspiracy theories that Yoon Suk-yeol and others were pushing, not only that the National Assembly election had been affected by China or North Korea, but that the DP were pro-North Korea, were anti-democracy, trying to overthrow the government, et cetera, or campaign on yeah, we're sorry, the guy from our party really did an unconstitutional act, which is reprehensible, but we still want to be in power. So I think they were so divided, and they seem to go back and forth in their messaging of embracing Yoon or run away from him. And it really, I think, there was sort of no way they were going to win the election.
Jenny, what's your thought about this? What I mentioned, the gender divide and the generational divide, and this about a potential split on the conservative camp?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bigger surprise that the PPP was as competitive as it was in
Okay.
this election than the idea that it was a little bit haphazard. I don't, nobody expected Yoon Suk-yeol to declare martial law. Nobody expected the prolonged political crisis that came from it. And when it came to the snap election, that doesn't give a lot of time to actually build a candidate, which it seems, the PPP just didn't have a very, deep bench. Whereas Lee Jae-myung was ready, had the name recognition, had run for president before. And, if you look at history, if you look at back after Park Geun-hye's administration, Park Geun-hye's impeachment, you had a very similar situation again, where, the PPP, or at that time it was, I forget what the name of it was, because again, the names change all the time.
Yeah.
But her party basically imploded afterwards, trying to deal with the fallout of how do you salvage the party after such a grave misconduct and abuse of power. So whether the name changes or not, I'm sure at some point they will come together again, find a new identity, find a new candidate, as Bruce talked about, a new personality to really kind of rally around, as they do over and over and over. We've seen this in South Korean politics. It's very fluid, and they tend to recover pretty quickly and unify and be relatively pragmatic about it when they need to be. Here, I think, again, they just didn't have a lot of time to make decisions. And you saw at the end where even Kim Moon-soo and Lee Jun-suk were talking about, what their chances were, if it was better together or not. So, I don't worry so much about where the Conservative Party is going and whether it's going to fraction and whether there'll be, really strong third parties. I think there's a lot of utility in what they do and a lot of, pragmatism in what they do if they really want to be to contest the next election. But this generational divide and the gender divide, gender has definitely become a big issue in South Korean domestic politics. And you saw Lee Jun-suk, for instance, really rally as the anti-feminist candidate. You saw Yoon Suk-yeol, back in the day, really play into that narrative of the anti-feminist. And so, I think we see a lot of this in the US as well. This isn't just a Korean trend. But, this idea of you build up something for people to blame for their lives not being as good as they want them to be. And it's in South Korea that has become gender. The gender issue has really been the target of your life isn't better because of greater gender equality or a move towards gender equality or feminism. And that is going to be a problem. And, we've already seen in the picks that Lee Jae-myung has made in his cabinet, it's majority male. Even if there is some generational differences, I think there's only been, one or two female picks. It'd be interesting to see what happens to things like, the gender ministry that used to exist, and where that agenda goes over the next, under a liberal administration, if there's some, again, effort to bring that to a more normal place and a more unifying place or not. But yeah, the generational divide, you see it here in the US too, and a lot of it is about, what are the opportunities for young people today compared to what generations before them was.
Yep.
And it's not getting better. And because it's not getting better, then what does that mean? Who do you blame? And who's the person that understands that and speaks to that in a way that is compelling and convincing? And I think that's really what you're seeing in this change of all of the generational change, even that there's pressure for in the presidential office itself.
Thank you. Let's for this insight on, let's say, the domestic situation and outcome of the election. Let's move and widen the scope and putting the binoculars north for some time and looking at some of the relations connected to the inter-Korean relations. I mean, he has called, President Lee, that is, has called for a shift away from confrontation and toward, I think was his term is phased engagement. And during his campaign, he issued a gradual easing of military tension. And you mentioned, both of you, the loudspeaker operations that was stopped, and North Korea reciprocated by stopping its loudspeaker operations. So at least the few citizens up in the DMC have a better daily life at the moment. So do you see a continuation of this gradual attempt to reduce tension, but maybe trying to reinstall parts of the CMA from 2018 or other types of trust building efforts? Any take on that, Bruce?
Well, I think certainly he is going to try to, re-engage with North Korea sort of any way he can. But as we've seen really over the decades, and particularly since, my understanding is neither the U.S. or South Korea has had meetings with North Koreans since October 2019 with the meetings in Stockholm between the U.S. and North Korea, where Pyongyang said we don't want any more of these disgusting bilateral meetings. So it's sort of, everyone's saying, I really want to talk to you, and then you're just sitting at home on a Saturday night hoping the phone will ring for a date. I've been told that, well, the first version of the story was that South Korean diplomats slipped a letter under the door of the New York mission of the North Korea to the UN, and then only to watch the letter get pushed back into the hallway. And I mentioned that to a South Korean diplomat. He said, well, no, that was the U.S. Did that. So maybe it was, both the U.S. and South Korea were trying to slip letters under the door and they just got pushed out. So it does sort of reflect how little North Korea seems to be interested in engagement. And as we've seen some media reporting just in the last week, that, even a letter from Trump to try to reignite the bromance was rejected. So that's I think a pretty telling issue. Now, whether the North Koreans knew it was from Trump or not, but that's pretty telling. And so I think we all see that North Korea is less interested right now in dialogue, whether it's because they were humiliated in the Hanoi summit, or more likely it's they're getting so many benefits from Russia with few or no conditions, much more than they could ever get from South Korea or the U.S. So sort of why talk to Seoul or Washington when you can get so much from your new best friend? And they still have, energized trade with China. So what's the point? And also some experts will point out that Kim may want to complete his 5-year strategic plan for nuclear and missile programs that he announced in January of 2021. But I think perhaps as long as the Ukraine conflict goes on and Russia is buying all these weapons and using North Korean troops and North Korean workers, Kim probably doesn't seem very interested. And, and then if we did get back in the same room, all the Korea watchers, we can debate what roadmap we should use. But they don't have a good track record as much as we want to try again. So, one last point is, I don't think North Korea is interested in having South Korea play a mediating role as it did back in 2018, 2019, because they have a direct relationship with Trump. And also, I think both the U.S. and North Korea realized that the Moon Jae-in administration was sort of spinning the truth when they would flit back and forth between the U.S. and North Korean diplomats, sort of, saying what each side had promised to do with the other, which wasn't exactly correct. So I think there's a lot of suspicion of what South Korea may do if it was a mediating role again.
What's your take on this, Jenny? Do you see a continuation of attempts from the South Korean side, especially, and maybe with some quiet support from Washington on trying to reduce some of the tension or ease some of the tension, in order to create some more favorable conditions for exchange dialogues? And what could that be?
The, Lee Jae-myung is definitely interested in lowering tensions and is going to take the measures that he thinks are easy to do, unilateral, to signal that there's an opportunity here. But I think there's limits to how much goodwill that will buy. And realistically, in North Korea, there's obviously been fundamental policy changes about how it views South Korea and its relationship with South Korea since Moon Jae-in was elected. So, it isn't just pick back up where we left off because, the leadership is more conducive to it. North Korea has in the meantime labeled South Korea a permanent hostile state, as it declared itself a permanent, sovereign state, has rejected the notion of unification, and has really, iced out South Korea over the past, since 2019. I think there was a lot of real disillusionment from the last round of negotiations where Moon Jae-in was very forward-leaning with North Korea, but really overpromised and under-delivered on an agenda that ended up requiring a lot of international cooperation to achieve, without being able to actually broker that international cooperation to move forward. And so if there's no independent agenda between the two Koreas anymore, like what you saw under, for instance, the Sunshine Policy era, then, what is the point? So you might be able to lower tensions, but as Bruce said, you're certainly not going to, North Korea doesn't see South Korea as relevant in a negotiation with the United States. If anything, if they want to pass messages, and if they want a spokesperson for their point of view, it's going to be Russia. It's not going to be South Korea. And there's just very little credibility, I think, for South Korea to be able to again re-engage on economic cooperation and all of that without real moves and real changes in the relationship with North Korea and the United States and the international community on the nuclear issue. And I have to say, given the Israel-Iran war right now, the conflict going on between the two, the prospects that North Korea will see at any point, anytime soon, any reason to find denuclearization in any form and nuclear negotiations in any form to be compelling, I think is really a long shot, given what's happening to Iran. And this really plays completely into the narrative of, of how North Korea views its place in the world, and what it's seen happen to other countries that don't have nuclear weapons. That have governments that, the West and the big powers don't like. So, this notion that South Korea can somehow offer something new without major changes on denuclearization, or North Korea's relations with the United States is very, it lacks credibility. And the prospects of getting back to negotiations on nuclear issues with North Korea, with the US under a Trump administration now, given how Trump is treating Iran and the Iran negotiations, I think is also of declining prospects as we speak.
I think this is another moment in international politics where suddenly we find that a issue is being hijacked by something that is not related, as maybe was the case by 9/11 and the end of the Sunshine Policy. And now we have the Israeli-Iran conflict that is kind of heavily impacting on the development of Korea Peninsula. But I'd like to add another perspective when it comes to inter-Korean relation. That's you both mentioned kind of the Russia perspective, and that North Korea currently finds itself in a rather favorable position because of its relations and agreements with Russia, benefiting from less isolation, benefiting from economic support, technical support, and also, in the end of the day, maybe, according to the agreement, having the support of the world's largest nuclear power in a case of a conflict. So, and what I understand, one of the President Lee's previous criticisms, he has previously criticized the former government's strong response to North Korean involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war. And if I phrase it correctly, Lee had said that we are getting involved in another country's war, and he has refrained from direct comments on the North Korean-Russian relationship. So what's behind his rather defensive posturing on this, as Russia's support to North Korea is so critical in the inter-Korean relations? And do you see that he is risking to kind of having this spilling over in his effort to reach out to the European Union and NATO? Do you have any? Because we have the NATO summit coming up in Den Haag soon, and I mean, one of the absolute priorities for Europe and NATO is to combat Russia. And here we have a nation supporting Russia, and South Korea is doing almost nothing.
Well, I'll jump in. I think it's consistent with sort of a series of South Korean administrations who sort of don't want to stick their head over the parapet on issues that they feel don't concern them, even though from a U.S. point of view, it certainly does, if you're a responsible nation. So, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 under Moon Jae-in, South Korea didn't join in on the sanctions right away. And I think it was only really after South Korea had been criticized by the international community for some time that South Korea sort of like, oh, okay, we'll do the right thing and get on board with sanctions. But the language really even under Yoon Suk Yeol was pretty moderate, and just sort of even though there was the whole Indo-Pacific 4 nations attending NATO and increasing talk of Asian or Indo-Pacific and European issues becoming more entwined, still there was not a kind of this very public criticism of Russia, because eventually it could be a trading partner again, or it perhaps could help on North Korea. Now, indirectly, South Korea was providing massive amounts of military assistance, or more 155 millimeter ammo than all of NATO had provided. So perhaps indirectly providing things, although that could have been a commercial venture. Similarly, South Korea's reluctance to talk much about Taiwan. They don't want to anger China. And you see articles and statements by officials of, well, Taiwan's very far away and it's a U.S. issue. And if the U.S. and China want to haggle over it, well, that's, their issue. And, many of us point out to South Korea that, if Taiwan goes red, that will have huge, perhaps even catastrophic impact on South Korea's economy, its security situation. And also pointing out that, we don't expect North Korea or South Korea to send the troops and the fleet. But if you don't get involved, if nothing else, stronger rear area support to the U.S., that will reflect quite poorly on South Korea. And as I've kind of, pointed out, if, South Korea should remember that its existence is because other nations came to its defense in 1950. If South Korea doesn't come to the defense of another democracy in the Indo-Pacific, maybe the UN sending states will have second thoughts if there's a Korean crisis, or it could have a very big impact on, if not the alliance with the US, sort of public and congressional viewpoints about South Korea.
Thank you, Jenny. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering at the beginning of the war, when Russia attacked Ukraine, North Korea wasn't involved yet.
No?
And so, there's definitely, I think when it first happened, even the US and around the world, there was overwhelming support for Ukraine and defending Ukraine. And I think for a very short time in South Korea that existed as well, in terms of, a lot of South Koreans kind of seeing themselves in Ukraine's situation of like, the world helped us in the past, it's our duty to be part of this movement. But as the war has dragged on, it is highly unpopular in South Korea. It is not an issue that South Korean public cares about. And especially when there's, more pressing domestic issues back home, right? So they worry more about the economy. They worry more about, even North Korea, but they worry about gender issues and wage gaps and housing, the cost of living rising and real estate rising. So it is a war to them that is very far away. They do not have a formal, alliance with Ukraine. And, their stance on it over time has, come into conformity with the international community, sort of on the margins of what they need to do, of what the international community wants them to do. I think you did see a moment when Russia and North Korea signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, where Yoon Suk-yeol did say, hey, Russia, you need to choose between your relationship between South Korea and North Korea. And Russia said, haha, no, we don't. And there hasn't really been a push for that to happen. And largely because of energy imports from Russia, I think, and trade relations. And so, I think there is a sense of trying to maintain some level of strategic flexibility when it comes to Russia. I think there's still hopes that I think South Korea probably still has hopes that the war will end soon. But their stake in it now is different, and it's much more focused on the North Korea component than on Russia itself. And so, I think there's still, with Lee Jae-myung, obviously he hasn't made any real statements about this yet, but it's also been a week.
Yeah.
And I'm sure at the NATO conference, he's going to say in conformity of, the NATO position on this. But, again, on the margins of what NATO might want them to do. And I think you even see this with Japan. Japan joined sanctions early with against Russia, and then eventually started importing Russian oil anyway because they needed it, right? So there is a certain level of national interest that goes into assessing how they deal with Russia that's different than the calculation that European countries have with Russia. But the North Korea component of this, I think, does restrict how much that relationship repairs without a real change in not necessarily the war status, although that would help, but with Russia's relationship with North Korea and Russia's military cooperation with North Korea. I think that's really where South Korea places its focus these days as to what is Russia doing, how much are they helping North Korea, and what does that mean for North Korea's advancing capabilities, both conventional and WMD. So, I think they're in the mix. They're on the right side. They're just not super definitive about it because they still have stakes in a relationship with Russia, although it's a much more limited relationship than it was.
Okay. Staying on the foreign policy side, and obviously having both of you participating on the screen here, I mean, we need to talk about the US-ROC relation and how the outcome of the election has been received in Washington. Has it raised expectation, nervousness, and what do you see going forward that the new administrations will likely do when it comes to its relation with the United States, both on the economic side, tariffs. Steel is a major export item for South Korea, for instance, and also when it comes to alliance and possible discussions of OPCON transfer, extended deterrence, and these kind of issues. So please feel free to pick some of the issues you think are important when it comes to ROK-US relations going forward. And on a small one, was Mr. Lee disappointed that he didn't have to meet Trump yesterday? Or maybe it was today the meeting should be in Canada.
I like how you phrased that, didn't have to meet.
Yeah. So, Jenny, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, the relationship with the US is not going to be easy. There's no two ways about this. I think if you look at even just the delayed phone call between Trump and Lee Jae-myung after the election, where, it wasn't day one, it was like day 3, which is unprecedented in terms of protocols. It gives you a sense of the challenges ahead. And I think if you look back to the first Trump administration, there was definitely antagonism between Trump and South Korea. That hasn't gone away. But an added factor this time around, and something to really keep note of, is when Lee Jae-myung won, you had leaders of MAGA tweeting about, the communists have taken over South Korea. The fall of South Korea, right? This is not going to help South Korea in dealing with Trump. If Trump already had, his own reservations about, what South Korea can do for him, having, the MAGA people in his ear saying, oh, he's a communist, he's bad, these kinds of things, you have to be tough on him. It's only going to make things harder. When it comes to, a lot of the policies, Lee Jae-myung made this comment of he would crawl between Trump's legs if that was what the country needed, which I hope it sounds better in Korean. But yeah. it was, I think he's willing to try to play the game up front, and I think they know what the key issues are going to be, and talking about increasing burden sharing, talking about not only the trade negotiations, but there is a sense now with this Trump administration of, what are you going to do for me if we do this for you? And I think the South Koreans get that. I think everyone gets that now. And so the question is how much are they willing to play that game? How long are they willing to play that game? And I think with Lee Jae-myung, I think he understands he has to, at least up front. But I don't know how long that lasts, where at some point there has to be some kind of principled, hey, we've done everything we can, we've bent over backwards, and you're still antagonizing us this way. What does this mean, right? And I think all of the allies are going through this right now. And I think at least, Trump is much more direct about his feelings about NATO, for instance, where there's still some bright spots that Trump talks about in US ROK relations, such as shipbuilding is still a relatively positive talking point in Trump's perceptions. So, it's going to be a rocky road. It's going to be filled with a lot of kind of maximal demands to see what he can get out of, to see what Trump can get out of the negotiations. I think everyone's braced for it. But, how much is enough is going to be a really big issue.
Okay. Bruce, do you agree with Jenny that this will be a rocky ride for US ROK relations?
I think very much. I mean, we could spend a whole hour on U.S. ROK relations. Maybe I'd have to have Jenny and I back for another show. It's on security issues. whether Trump tries to, reopen the special measures agreement negotiations or not, either directly or indirectly, he may be asking for greater contribution from South Korea to offset the costs of U.S. forces there. Even though it's in our interest to have alliances, it's in our interest to have troops overseas, deterring, and then, if necessary, defending. In his first term, he tried to literally make a profit off of our sons and daughters in uniform, et cetera. There's also going to be a demand for, greater contribution, of defense spending as a part of their GDP, even though South Korea is spending 2.8% of its GDP, which is more than most NATO nations. There's sort of well, that's fine, but it needs to be 3 or 5%, higher levels than the US is even spending. And then there is a priority in the US thinking of the China threat. And so we're not hearing the traditional alliance hawks of we will be there to defend against North Korea. It's more of yeah, you guys are good. You can handle it. We're going to be focused on China. And oh, by the way, what are you going to be doing against China, either Taiwan or other areas of the Indo-Pacific? On the tariffs, the fact that we're treating our friends as badly as our, opponents, when there's clearly no basis for the level of tariffs that Trump has imposed on South Korea and others. It's clearly based on trade imbalance rather than any kind of tariffs that South Korea has imposed on the U.S. And it's just really a protection racket on the security side, and just, sort of Godfather Donald Corleone demanding, gifts and payments in order not to, punish someone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sort of a preemptive gift giving where you hope it will prevent, strong economic retaliation. And what we saw with both Japan and South Korea is right before the Liberation Day announcement, Prime Minister Ishiba had announced, pledges of, economic investment and purchases, and South Korea CEOs were over there announcing, tens of billions of dollars in more investment, and yet both Japan and South Korea were whacked with high tariffs afterwards.
One of the signature, staying the last couple of minutes within this foreign policy arena, one of the signature policies of President Yoon was his kind of reach out to Japan and try to mend the relations between ROC and Japan, that for many different reasons is really troublesome. Now we have a new president with a party that is maybe even more resentful to mending those ties. But do you think that he will maintain the recent agreements being made between Japan and South Korea and the trilateral alliance, if I may say so, between the two and United States? Or do you think there will be a risk of moving back to the situation before 2020? Bruce, please.
I don't think he will sort of formally undo the forced labor agreement as Moon Jae-in undid the Comfort Women agreement.
Yep.
I think they know that's a bridge too far. It would be too blatant in action. But I think the DP will have a much lower threshold for feeling insulted if a Japanese official says or does something that they feel doesn't suitably reflect remorse for the occupation of the peninsula. So I think it's, in a way, just waiting for the shoe to drop of Japan doing something, and then the DP will much more quickly take umbrage and much more strongly take umbrage than the PPP would, even without Yoon Suk-yeol in the picture.
Mm. And that, if I may ask a follow-up, that may make it difficult for the new administration to kind of continue and even enhance the relationship, because there may be this risk of having some internal discussion within the party.
I think they will continue it, but with much less enthusiasm than Yoon Suk-yeol. And if there's a bump in the road, I think, the car will go off the road or turn around and go back. than willing to just, yeah, we had a bump, but we're going to keep going in the same direction.
Okay. Jenny, what's your take on ROK-Japan relations and the new
Yeah, I mean,
administration?
I tend to agree on the security front. I think, Lee Jae-myung will try to live up to the obligations that have already been set forward. Everything else, I think is really open, will be swayed by, Japanese actions in the coming months and years that Lee Jae-myung is president, and they definitely will be more sensitive to insensitivity from the Japanese. But I do think there's also a little bit of an X factor here of, depending on where US-ROK relations goes, it might actually create greater incentive to try and stabilize ROK-Japan relations in the absence of very strong, or to hedge against an absence of very strong alliance relations with the United States.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. I'm extremely grateful to both of you, Jenny and Bruce, for sharing your precious time with us, discussing this very, very interesting topic. And I'm sure when we meet, hopefully in the near future, we will come back and continue our discussions on this. And for those of you who missed our strategic talk on the 12th of June, it's available recorded on our webpage, as this one will be soon. So please stay tuned. And once more, thank you, Jenny and Bruce, and enjoy the day. And in Sweden, we have the Midsummer Festival coming up, where we will have a lot of herring and snaps and fun. So thank you very much, and
Great.
goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.